Imagine this. You're settling into your seat on a flight, ready to relax after a long day. The hum of the engines, the faint chatter of passengers, the promise of a smooth journey ahead. But for one man, that calm was shattered in an instant. Not by turbulence, but by something far more unsettling. A confrontation that would spark outrage, divide opinions, and leave everyone asking, how could this happen? This is the story of a racist flight attendant who thought she could kick a black man from his seat without consequences. But what she didn't know was that her actions would set off a chain of events so dramatic, so swift, that just 7 minutes later she'd be handed the most shocking news of her career. This isn't just a story about prejudice or power. It's about accountability, justice, and the moment everything changed. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll be on the edge of your seat, waiting to see how it all unfolds. It all started on a routine flight, one of hundreds that take off every day. Passengers were boarding, stowing their luggage and finding their seats. Among them was James, a soft-spoken man in his early 30s who had just finished a business trip and was looking forward to getting home. He'd chosen his seat carefully, a window seat near the front of the plane, and had already buckled in, scrolling through his phone to pass the time. But as the cabin filled up, a flight attendant approached him. Her name was Linda, a veteran employee with years of experience. At first, James thought she was just doing her job, maybe checking his ticket or offering a pre-flight drink. But the look on her face told a different story. Her tone was sharp, her words clipped. "Sir, you need to move. This seat isn't yours." James was confused. He double-checked his ticket, showed it to her, and politely explained that he was in the right seat. But Linda wasn't having it. Her voice grew louder, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "I don't care what your ticket says. You need to move to the back of the plane." The demand was clear, and so was the implication. James felt a knot form in his stomach. Was this really happening? Was he being singled out because of the color of his skin? He tried to stay calm, to reason with her, but Linda's demeanor only grew more aggressive. "If you don't move, I'll have you removed from this flight," she snapped. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do. Some pulled out their phones, discreetly recording the scene. Others looked away, not wanting to get involved. But James knew he couldn't back down. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about respect, dignity, and the right to be treated fairly. What happened next would shock everyone on that plane. As James stood his ground, Linda made good on her threat. She called for backup, and within minutes, 2 airline staff members arrived. They listened to Linda's side of the story, but didn't bother to hear James out. The situation escalated quickly, and before he knew it, James was being escorted off the plane. The other passengers watched in stunned silence as he walked down the aisle, his head held high but his heart heavy. It was a moment that would stay with them long after the flight landed. But as the plane doors closed and James was left standing on the tarmac, something unexpected happened. A passenger in first class, who had witnessed the entire ordeal, decided they weren't going to let this slide. They pulled out their phone and made a call, not to a friend, but to someone who could make a difference. And that's when everything changed. 7 minutes. That's all it took. 7 minutes from the moment James was removed from the plane to the moment Linda's world came crashing down. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Linda was going about her duties, seemingly unfazed by what had just happened. But then, her phone buzzed. It was a call from her supervisor. Her stomach dropped as she answered, her mind racing. What could they possibly want? The conversation was brief, but the words hit her like a ton of bricks. "Linda, we've received a complaint about your conduct. Effective immediately, you're relieved of your duties. Please report to the office as soon as we land." The line went dead, leaving Linda in stunned silence. Her hands trembled as she hung up, her mind replaying the events of the last hour. How had it come to this? She had always prided herself on being a professional, on handling difficult situations with ease. But this time she had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the plane soared through the sky, the atmosphere in the cabin was tense. Passengers whispered to each other, speculating about what had just happened. Some felt a sense of relief, glad that justice had been served. Others were conflicted, unsure of how to feel about Linda's sudden dismissal. And then there were those who couldn't shake the image of James being led off the plane, his dignity stripped away in front of everyone. What would happen to him? Would the airline make things right? And what about Linda? Was this the end of her career or just the beginning of a much larger reckoning? The questions hung in the air unanswered as the plane continued its journey. But one thing was clear, this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as the story began to spread, it would ignite a firestorm of debate, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about race, power, and the cost of standing up for what's right. So, what happened next? Did James get the justice he deserved? Did Linda face further consequences, or was this just a temporary setback? And what about the other passengers, those who watched it all unfold? How did this experience change them? The answers to these questions are coming up in the next part of the story. But for now, let this sink in. Sometimes it only takes 7 minutes for everything to change. 7 minutes to expose the truth, to hold someone accountable, to remind us all that no one is above doing the right thing. And sometimes those 7 minutes can feel like a lifetime. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. As the plane continued its journey, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their minds racing with questions. What had just happened? Who was James, and why had he been treated so unfairly? And what would become of Linda, the flight attendant who had seemed so confident just moments ago? The answers to these questions were still unclear, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary flight. This was a moment that would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. To understand how things had escalated so quickly, we need to rewind a bit. James wasn't just any passenger. He was a man who had spent his life working hard, overcoming obstacles, and striving to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. Growing up in a small town, he had faced his share of challenges, but he had always believed in the power of perseverance. He had built a successful career in marketing, traveling frequently for work, and had never encountered a situation like this before. For him, flying was usually a mundane part of his routine. But today, it had become something else entirely. A stark reminder that for some people, fairness and equality were still out of reach. Linda, on the other hand, had been with the airline for over a decade. She had started as a young woman with big dreams, eager to see the world and meet new people. Over the years, she had built a reputation as a no-nonsense professional, someone who could handle even the most difficult passengers with ease. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. Colleagues had noticed that she had become more rigid, less patient, and quicker to judge. Some attributed it to the stress of the job, while others whispered about personal issues she might be dealing with. Whatever the reason, it was clear that Linda wasn't the same person she had been when she started. And today, that change had come to a head in the most public way possible. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the passengers couldn't stop thinking about what they had witnessed. Among them was Sarah, a college student who had been sitting just a few rows behind James. She had watched the entire scene unfold, her heart pounding as she debated whether to intervene. She had felt a mix of anger and helplessness, unsure of what she could do to help. But when she saw James being escorted off the plane, something inside her snapped. She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, determined to share what she had seen with the world. By the time the plane landed, her tweet had already started to gain traction, with people expressing their outrage and demanding answers from the airline. Meanwhile, in first class, another passenger was grappling with his own emotions. Mark, a middle-aged businessman, had been traveling for work and had initially been too preoccupied with his laptop to notice what was happening. But when he heard the commotion, he looked up and saw James being led away. Something about the scene had struck a chord with him, stirring memories of his own experiences with discrimination. He had grown up in a different era, when racial tensions were even more pronounced, and he had always told himself that things were better now. But seeing James treated so unfairly made him question that belief. He knew he had to do something. But what? As he sat there, lost in thought, he realized that this moment was a turning point, not just for James, but for everyone on that plane. Back in the cabin, Linda was trying to maintain her composure, but it wasn't easy. The call from her supervisor had left her shaken, and she couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind. Had she really been that harsh? She had always prided herself on being fair, but now she wasn't so sure. As she went through the motions of her job, handing out drinks, answering questions, smiling politely, she felt a growing sense of dread. What would happen when the plane landed? Would she lose her job? And if she did, how would she explain it to her family? These questions swirled in her mind, making it hard to focus on anything else. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin only grew. Passengers were eager to get off the plane and find out what would happen next. Some were already planning to file complaints with the airline, while others were determined to share their experiences on social media. For James, who was still standing on the tarmac, the wait was even more agonizing. He had been told to wait for further instructions, but no one had given him any clear answers. Would he be allowed back on the plane? Would he be compensated for the inconvenience, or would he simply be left to deal with the fallout on his own? As he stood there, watching the plane disappear into the distance, he couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. He had done everything right. He had followed the rules, stayed calm, and tried to reason with Linda, but none of that had mattered in the end. When the plane finally landed, the passengers were met with a scene they hadn't expected. News of the incident had already started to spread, and a small crowd had gathered at the gate. Reporters with cameras and microphones were there, eager to get the story. Passengers were bombarded with questions as they stepped off the plane, their faces a mix of confusion and frustration. Some were eager to share their side of the story, while others just wanted to get away from the chaos. But for James, who was still waiting on the tarmac, the ordeal was far from over. As he was finally escorted back to the terminal, he was met with a barrage of questions from reporters. How was he feeling? What had happened on the plane? Did he plan to take legal action? James tried to answer as best he could, but the experience was overwhelming. All he wanted was to go home and put this behind him, but he knew that wasn't going to be easy. As for Linda, her worst fears were realized when she was met by her supervisor at the gate. The look on his face said it all. She was in serious trouble. She was escorted to a private room where she was told that an investigation was underway. Her actions on the plane had been deemed unacceptable, and she was being placed on immediate leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Linda tried to explain herself, to argue that she had just been doing her job, but the words sounded hollow even to her. Deep down, she knew she had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But the story didn't end there. As the hours turned into days, the incident continued to make headlines. Social media was ablaze with outrage, with people from all walks of life weighing in on what had happened. Some defended Linda, arguing that she had been put in a difficult position and had simply made a mistake. Others were less forgiving, calling for her to be fired and for the airline to take responsibility for its actions. The airline itself was under immense pressure to respond, and it wasn't long before they issued a statement. They apologized to James and promised a full investigation, but for many, that wasn't enough. People wanted answers, accountability, and change. As the days passed, James found himself at the center of a storm he had never asked for. He was inundated with messages of support, but also with criticism and even threats. Some people accused him of exaggerating the story or trying to profit from it, while others praised him for standing up for himself. It was a lot to process, and James wasn't sure how to navigate it all. All he knew was that he couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about him, it was about something much bigger. It was about fairness, equality, and the right to be treated with respect, no matter who you are. And so, as the story continued to unfold, one thing became clear: this was far from over. The incident on the plane had sparked a conversation that needed to be had, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. For James, Linda, and everyone else involved, the journey was just beginning. And as they each grappled with the fallout, they were forced to confront difficult questions about themselves, their actions, and the world they lived in. What would happen next? Would justice be served? Or would this moment be forgotten, just another story in the endless stream of news? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: this was a story that no one would soon forget. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout from the incident on the plane continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could have anticipated. For James, the initial shock had given way to a mix of emotions: anger, frustration, and a deep sense of exhaustion. He had become the face of a story he never wanted to be part of, and the weight of that responsibility was heavy. Reporters called daily, asking for interviews, while social media buzzed with opinions about what had happened. Some people hailed him as a hero, a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Others accused him of blowing things out of proportion, of playing the victim for attention. James tried to tune out the noise, but it wasn't easy. Everywhere he looked, there was another headline, another comment, another reminder of that day on the plane. Meanwhile, Linda was grappling with her own set of challenges. Being placed on leave had left her in a kind of limbo, unsure of what the future held. She spent her days at home, replaying the incident in her mind, wondering how things had gone so wrong. Her family tried to be supportive, but they didn't fully understand what she was going through. Her teenage daughter, Emily, had seen the videos online and couldn't hide her disappointment. "Mum, how could you do that?" she had asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Linda didn't have an answer. She had always prided herself on being a good role model for her daughter, but now she felt like she had failed her in the worst way possible. The guilt was overwhelming, and it only grew as the days passed. At the airline, the pressure was mounting. The company's PR team was working overtime to manage the crisis, but it was clear they were fighting a losing battle. Social media was flooded with calls for accountability, and hashtags like Mass Justice for James and Shush Fire Linda were trending worldwide. The airline's CEO, a man named Richard Hayes, knew he had to act fast. He called an emergency meeting with his senior staff, determined to find a way to salvage the company's reputation. But as they debated their options, it became clear that there were no easy answers. Firing Linda might appease some people, but it wouldn't address the deeper issues at play. And if they didn't handle this carefully, they risked making things even worse. Behind the scenes, another story was unfolding, one that few people knew about. Sarah, the college student who had witnessed the incident, had become an unlikely activist. Her tweet about what had happened had gone viral, and she had been inundated with messages from people who wanted to help. At first, she wasn't sure what to do. She was just a student, after all, not a politician or a lawyer. But as she read through the messages, she realized that she had a unique opportunity to make a difference. She started organizing online, connecting with other passengers from the flight and gathering their stories. Together, they formed a group called Passengers for Justice, dedicated to holding the airline accountable and pushing for systemic change. It was a daunting task, but Sarah was determined to see it through. As the group gained momentum, they caught the attention of a civil rights attorney named Marcus Green. Marcus had been following the story closely and saw it as a potential landmark case. He reached out to James, offering to represent him pro bono. At first, James was hesitant. He wasn't sure he wanted to drag things out in court to relive the experience over and over again. But Marcus convinced him that this was about more than just one incident. It was about sending a message that discrimination wouldn't be tolerated. After much deliberation, James agreed. The lawsuit was filed, and suddenly the stakes were even higher. For Linda, the news of the lawsuit was a devastating blow. She had hoped that things might blow over, that she could eventually return to her job and put this behind her. But now, with the possibility of a lengthy legal battle looming, that hope was fading fast. She reached out to the airline's union for support, but even they seemed hesitant to back her fully. "We'll do what we can," her union rep told her, "but you have to understand, this is a tough situation." Linda felt more alone than ever, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. As the legal proceedings began, new details started to emerge. Passengers who had been on the flight came forward with their own accounts, some supporting James and others defending Linda. The media seized on every development, turning the case into a national spectacle. Talk shows debated the issue. Pundits weighed in, and the public remained deeply divided. Some saw James as a victim of systemic racism, while others viewed Linda as a scapegoat, a hard-working employee who had made a mistake under pressure. The truth, as always, was more complicated than it seemed. Amid all the chaos, James found himself reflecting on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him or Linda. It was about a system that allowed things like this to happen in the first place. He started speaking out, not just about his own experience, but about the need for broader change. He joined forces with Sarah and the Passengers for Justice group, using his platform to advocate for better training and accountability. In the airline industry, it was a daunting task, but James felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was making a difference, but even as he threw himself into the fight, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The lawsuit was just the beginning, and there were no guarantees about how it would end. Would the airline take responsibility for what had happened? Would Linda face consequences, or would she be able to move on with her life? And what about the passengers who had witnessed it all? How would this experience change them? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the story continued to unfold. One thing was certain. This was a moment that would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. For James, it was a chance to stand up for what he believed in, to fight for a world where no one had to go through what he had. For Linda, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that actions have consequences, and for the rest of us, it was a stark reminder that the fight for equality and justice is far from over. The story wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. And as the next chapter began, one thing was clear: the world was watching.